Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our second episode in our series on grasslands that we're calling Culture, Conservation, and Resiliency. I love seeing folks dropping in where they're watching from all across the US and Canada and even beyond. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Nielenbrock. I am the director of the Institute for Science and Policy. We are a project at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Together with our partners, we've been able to bring you this four-part series. So I want to acknowledge and thank them, the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, the Center for Collaborative Conservation at Colorado State University, as well as the Salazar Center for North American Conservation, also at CSU. I do remind us that people have lived in North America and the grasslands for thousands of years, and Indigenous people are still very much present on our grasslands today. Where I'm sitting at right now, I'm at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and this place was the original homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations and people. This is a public four-part series we're bringing you. If you missed our first one that we did last week, we really focused in on a lot of topics, but primarily around the science of grasslands. We do have a video recording already available for that if you want to go ahead and watch that. We are bringing you this four-part series because it's part of this larger effort that's been going on called the Central Grasslands Roadmap. It's brought together hundreds of individuals and organizations working on resilient and sustainable grasslands as well as human communities. You can learn more at grasslandsroadmap.org if you're not familiar with that effort. We'll also be sharing any links to the videos and to that roadmap effort at the end of today's program. Today is about people and culture. Grasslands have a long cultural and evolutionary history. Prior to European settlement on the continent, native and indigenous people cultivated their own relationship and management practices with these ecosystems. Ranching was introduced and it brought a different approach, bringing new principles of agriculture and grazing to the range. Today, we're going to be talking about both. And we're very lucky to have really two special guests joining us today. They're going to bring their own unique perspectives to the conversation. We have Jason Baldus with us. Jason is an enrolled member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe. He received both his bachelor's and master's degree in land resource and environmental studies from Montana State University, where he focused on the restoration of buffalo and bison to tribal lands. He currently serves as the president and executive director of the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative and the tribal program, and is the tribal program buffalo manager at the National Wildlife Federation Tribal Partnership Program. He's also serving as an adjunct professor and in the boards of multiple organizations. In 2016, he spearheaded the successful effort to relocate a herd to the Wind River Indian Reservation and works with both the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes in buffalo management and expansion. He's an advocate, an educator, and a speaker on Indigenous cultural revitalization and ecological restoration. Thank you, Jason, for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Kristen. I'm doing very well. Glad to be here and visit with everybody about the importance of many of our grasslands and how tribes and sovereignty and the history ties into how we can manage them better today.
Great. Look forward to hearing a little bit more from you.
Thank you.
We also have Maggie Hanna joining us today. Maggie is the Director of External Relations for the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, where she began working since in 2015. Since her time at the Land Trust, she has facilitated conservation easements, supported annual monitoring, and managed the Leopold Conservation Award. Prior to joining CCALT, and this is a mouthful, so you'll hear us say CCALT a few times, or the Land Trust, Maggie worked for the El Pomar Foundation as a fellow and also served in the AmeriCorps volunteer program in Oregon. Maggie received her bachelor's from Trinity University in History and Urban Studies and completed a graduate certificate in ranch management from Texas Christian University. She was recognized by the Denver Business Journal's 2021 Who's Who in Agriculture. In addition to her work with the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, she also manages her family's fourth generation cattle operation southeast of Colorado Springs, Colorado. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us today. How are you doing?
Thank you, Kristen. It is an honor to join you and Jason here today to talk about people and cultures of the grasslands. As you noted, I am a fourth generation cattle operator in Southern Colorado. We have since the 1940s existed in this community, and for 2 generations prior, we're located in north central New Mexico. So the grasslands have been connected to our cattle operation for many generations. I have the unique opportunity of a dual career in that I have the opportunity to be involved in our cattle operation and support farm and ranch land conservation around the state of Colorado through my work at the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust. CCALT was founded in 1995 to deliver conservation solutions to Colorado's farm and ranch families. One of the things, and we will see it largely in the grassland conversation, is how important having private lands conserved is as we look at the patchwork of public lands, tribal lands, and other large landscapes, and ensuring that we are protecting functional ecosystems and landscapes for the future.
Thank you. I'm glad to have both of you joining us here today. Just one quick housekeeping note for our audience who's joined us. If you open the chat, that's going to be where you can ask questions of our guests. Anything you're curious about, let us know. We will do our best to work those questions into the conversation. We'll be here for about an hour, wrapping up at about 1 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going to send you my apologies in advance if we don't get to all your questions. It is a large audience today, but we will do our best to work as many as we can into the conversation. So let me just start and ask both of our guests, and maybe I'll start with Jason and Maggie. You can elaborate and follow on a little bit more to talk a little bit just about who you are and sharing with our audience about your connection to grasslands. Jason, would you start for us, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Again, glad to be here. And my name is Jason Baldus. I'm a member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe from the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. I received my undergraduate and graduate degrees at Montana State, go Bobcats, and I've continued to work on or focused on tribal buffalo or bison restoration throughout my academic career. And you hear me say bison and buffalo interchangeably. Bison is obviously the scientific term for the animal. But buffalo is more common in our tribal communities. Of course, we have over 300 different indigenous languages in this continent. We have our own names for them in our languages. And so in the Shoshone language, it's Bojan. And so that animal, as we revitalize our reconnection to buffalo, we're also thinking about our language revitalization, our reconnection to the animal. And so in 2016, we brought the first 10, and these are considered conservation bison. They have the most reputable genetics. Of course, when Lewis and Clark came west in 1804, they witnessed 30 to 60 million bison. But by 1902, there were less than 1,000 in the States, and they say that there was 23 or 24 left in Yellowstone. And so those Yellowstone genetics are very important today as we improve the heterogeneity, the herd health of many of our conservation populations. Because if you look at the number of bison in the United States, it's around 800,000 or so. 95 to 98% of those animals have cattle gene introgression. So the bison genome itself is under threat. There's less than 25,000 conservation bison. And so the Wind River tribes, the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho, who share the Wind River Reservation, we've been able to build programs simultaneously, collaboratively, to move towards a paradigm shift of managing these animals on the landscape as a wildlife species, protected under our own tribal codes and regulations. And so today we have to go to parks and refuges and private ranches essentially to see bison. They don't exist on the landscape as a wildlife species, but on our tribal lands, we can ensure that they do. And so that process does take some time, because of the history. And that history is somewhat not always positive. And so the land base of the tribes has diminished significantly since Europeans and settlers, pioneers arrived in our territory. And just to share with you real quick, I can pull up a map here that shows the 1863 Treaty of Fort Bridger. This is overlaid on a modern map that shows where some places you may know, Salt Lake City, Pocatello, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. This was in the original territory and treaty of the 1863. Only 5 years later, largely due to the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Mormon Trail, the reservation was reduced by 41 million acres. There were subsequent losses of lands and imposed land use systems that were forced the tribes into agriculture, into cattle and grazing. These land use systems are different than what was here for millennia because our people were ecologically based. Our health and wealth was directly related to the biodiversity of plants and animals that were in our territory. And so that livelihood, that connection changed with colonization and assimilation, but we've successfully managed the 6 of the 7 ungulate species on this reservation, including the protection of wolves and bears, because we recognize them as being important components. We actually call them our relatives, that they are placed here with us by the creator above. And that when we, in our languages, we say, Besihi Neteina, or Dhamma Nerawura, that means all our relatives. And that means not only our 2-legged relatives, but also the 4-legged, the winged, the furred, even the ones that crawl above and below the ground. Because that is our perspective on our connection. And that really it ties well with conservation, our understanding of ecology and in environmental science that teaches the interrelatedness, the interconnectedness of all of these components in this living system that we're all part of. And so it is a paradigm shift. It is a process to get towards managing bison on the landscape as wildlife, because it's a very, these systems have been in place for 130 years, and dismantling or decolonizing our land use is somewhat takes a little bit of time, and partnership and collaboration is making that possible. So it's very rewarding to see buffalo coming back in a way that's not only culturally meaningful, but also ecologically, that we're restoring keystone species to the landscape for integrity.
Thank you, Jason, for sharing. I want to hopefully come back and dive into a little bit more of what you just shared there. But why don't I bring Maggie into this conversation? Maggie, why don't you share a little bit more about who you are and some of the connections to grasslands that you bring to this conversation?
Absolutely. You have heard my background and my education and my career. One of the things that makes me most excited about this overlap of being an agricultural operator myself and having the opportunity to create impact in the conservation space is I have long seen landscape scale conservation as rural community conservation. When we eliminate the ability for people to function in a place, we basically eliminate the value of that place. And I think one of the challenges in particularly Eastern Colorado, as we look at grasslands and how we ensure that communities and people can thrive in a place, is making sure that we are not risking conversion and fragmentation of landscapes that do function, and they function relatively holistically. I obviously am connected to grasslands because it is the location in which I was raised. It is the place that we ranch, and it is the most close relationship I have to any landscape. I think one of the things that I have always been attracted to about grasslands in particular, and making sure that we give them their due attention, is the subtlety of grasslands, of prairies. I can't speak for other places. We have a lot of locations represented on this meeting, but for Colorado, it's people come to this state to see the mountains and the trees and the rivers, but half of our state is grasslands, and half of our state is there is nuance and subtlety and beauty and intricacies of the grasslands and the people of grasslands that I have always felt went a little bit underrepresented as we talk about tourism and how we support an economy and where our ag products come from. So my interest in the grasslands has largely come from a space of conserving an ability to support rural communities. I was raised here on the Hanna Ranch, 7 miles southeast of Fountain, Colorado. So I am really quite close to the Front Range of Colorado. I was born into a ranch family. My dad was an interesting character in that he made a lot of people uncomfortable and was making an effort to build bridges between the agricultural and environmental communities, which for those of you who have followed this conversation for any length of time in the 80s and 90s was not a super friendly conversation. I think in the long run, one of our greatest challenges of landscape scale management is vocabulary. We all have a vested interest in seeing these lands through to another generation. And I think that was a really important lesson for me as a child. My dad passed away when I was young, so I have a sort of unique opportunity to be an incredibly young operator without the mentorship necessarily of the generation ahead of me. I think that has opened the door for me to make a lot of mistakes and to look at this land and learn how to listen as an operator, because this becomes my mentor. This land becomes my mentor, and this is my connection to a generational past. But it is also my future, and it has brought me into a lot of conversations that are incredibly uncomfortable. For those of you not in Colorado, I will share, we are having a huge conversation around renewable energy, and we have immense pressures to convert grasslands of Colorado to solar power, which eliminates a human relationship to that landscape, and it becomes just a commodity producing a utility for our urban centers. And so how do we protect these functional ecosystems and functional landscapes in a way that can also see the future and support another generation down the road? So that is my connection to land and grasslands and this small little cow-calf operation on the Front Range of Colorado.
Thank you, Maggie. I appreciate it. I appreciate both of your all's connection and personal stories here. How about we take this into thinking a little bit about history? It's so important to understand the history. Jason, you shared a little bit about some of the original treaty in 1863 and the impact that had when that treaty was downsized, the land was downsized a few years later. But perhaps in relation to our understanding culturally and personally to grasslands, have there been some significant moments that you would like to touch on that would help share for our audience kind of that history about understanding that and why they're important today as they have been important throughout history? Looking at both of you and whoever wants to chime in first. Jason, why don't you start, and Maggie can follow along, please.
Yeah, I think a lot of about the way that my people used to live sustainably on the landscape, and they would venture to grasslands, to mountains, and being in Wyoming, we're part of the edge of the Great Plains. We have short grass, prairie, high desert shrub grasslands. and that is a unique ecosystem. But if we try to talk about the way that people lived, we often hear nomadic. And that is a term that we go to often to describe the way that my grandmas and grandpas lived. But if you look up the term, it actually in some definitions says wandering aimlessly. But they definitely were not. They knew exactly where they were going at certain times of the year and for what resources. They would be for different animals to hunt. It'd be for different medicines or tools that could be gathered. Some of our neighbor tribes have lived in the grasslands for a very long time and adapted very well to some of the harsh environments that are there. There's certain plant species that grow to the size of 80 pounds, and if you know what this little flower is that's peeking out of the ground, you would know where to dig and find this root that could feed your family for an extended period of time. There's certain plants that bloom that can indicate when others food plants are available and ready. So the knowledge that the people had about the grassland allowed them to coexist for millennia and have a very intricate relationship with the foods and the medicines and the things that lived on and were part of those grassland ecosystems. Our Shoshone people, we ventured to the grasslands at certain times of the year, and then to the mountains at certain times of the year, and then settled in the winter at certain times. But it was a cyclical understanding. The understanding that seasons and cycles dictate your life was part of this understanding of the cosmos. The sun that moves across the sky is tied to the cycles of the moon, which the summer solstice, the equinox, all of the seasonal changes were very well understood, and they moved based on those cycles and seasons. And if we look across the planet, the most abundant symbol that we see is a circle. You see it when you throw it in a rock in the water. A bird builds its nest that way. The people understood that everything happens in circles and cycles, and that worldview really dictated where and what they did and for what purposes. And so we need a new term other than nomadic, but that grassland ecosystems were very, very important to many, many tribes for a very long time.
I will just add, as we sort of evaluate human relationships to grasslands, maybe the shortest relationship is of farming and ranching in the grasslands. And I certainly don't represent every farmer or rancher, but in my work with the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, I do have the opportunity to interact with many generational farmers and ranchers who have made the grasslands an important part of their family, of their community, and of their operations. And I think, one of the most curious parts about the lessons we learn every day as people is our collective memory to the lessons learned. And I think one of the spaces that I worry about now, there are several studies around the acreage lost every year to conversion of grasslands in North America. And I just saw one on the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's website about between 2014 and 2018, we were losing almost 4 acres of grasslands every single minute. And those acres are being converted for housing developments, other farming practices. They are being removed from native grass species to an introduced species. or sometimes energy development. Any number of conversion factors exist. And, you know, we just learned this lesson. I obviously wasn't alive for it, but within our collective memory, the Great Plains have navigated the Dust Bowl. And so we know the lesson of converting native prairie grasslands. And the fact that here we are presenting these opportunities again, because there are financial incentives to conversion, is a really scary factor of human relationships to these places. And, you know, I don't aim to solve the solution of capitalism and that there are financial incentives to specific outcomes. But I do think one of the things that I hope we can take away collectively as humans is that humans have made life in the grasslands for thousands of years. If we can remember how to function cyclically, like Jason mentioned, and be responsive to what the land tells us and when the seasons change and what we can produce and how we can interact with landscapes. I do think there are opportunities to come back to a place where humans function, have a high functioning relationship with grasslands. But I do sometimes worry that, you know, we learned this lesson in the 1930s, and here we are again, pressuring native prairie grasslands under current management to convert to another use. So the human interaction on the farm and ranch side is a relatively short history in the grand scheme of things. But I do think, like I mentioned earlier, we do all have a vested interest in seeing these places through to another generation.
Thank you both. Very well said. I want to pick back up and we'll start off with Maggie and Jason, please chime in too. I'm wondering if you could share with our audience, you started to talk about some of the economic incentives to not keep grasslands, to convert them to something else. Could you both provide examples of both some of the economic and livelihood benefits that grasslands provide to either the ranching community, the rural community, Maggie, as where you said, and Jason, to the Shoshone tribe? Make this very tangible for our audience. What are the current benefits of maintaining those grasslands?
Such a good question. What are the current benefits? The current benefits, I have to be sometimes careful about when I have which hat on because I wear a lot of hats. So I'm going to answer this question as the owner and manager of Hanna Ranches Incorporated. We currently operate very near the Front Range. We are a native shortgrass prairie operation. I currently have cattle stocked at almost 90 acres to the animal. So the ability to actually generate a living from this place has become very challenging. We have been in drought conditions for comfortably the last 3 years, but I would say a majority of the last decade. And so in my community, and this is just very rough math, but we're being pressured with some pretty substantial solar development right now. Consider that 1 acre of shortgrass prairie is worth $1,000. We have the presentation of solar companies in our community offering almost $600 an acre per year on a 40-year lease to contract with solar development. Solar development in this region is high fence, so it eliminates migration corridors for wildlife species. They are not currently constructed in a way that is grazable underneath, with the exception of sheep and goats, but we do not exist in a market that is easily accessible for sheep and goats. So there are some sort of systemic issues with food production in that the American population often isn't demanding sheep and goat meat in the same way that they are demanding other meat proteins. So we have these market influences that are sort of driving what livestock is produced. But these solar companies are offering $600 a year on a 40-year lease, which means what operator has an incentive to keep that as a functional grassland? Almost not. Like, the finances just don't function well. I can raise one cow on almost 100 acres, which for people who are not familiar with acres, you can imagine a football field is roughly an acre of land. And so there's huge challenges in both our food system, our commodity pricing systems, and sort of generally our value structure. To put my hat back on for the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, one of the things that is challenging is that the way that you value conservation easements is the value before unencumbered property. So what that property would sell for pre-conservation easement, and then the difference between what it will sell for with a restriction of a conservation easement. And that difference makes the conservation value. And if there are, when we add pressure, your conservation value grows. So there is actually some value to keeping these landscapes intact financially for operators. There are a number of tools through the federal farm bill in the US and state and local programs. And I think the other piece that we've sort of watched with like big sort of charismatic megafauna habitat restoration, like the wolf, the bear, and bison, is there is value in seeing these landscapes function holistically. And there is real value in making sure that these ecosystems are not so far degraded that we have removed species entirely from a place. But that's a hard value to put a number on when an operator is looking at owing the bank or making a living. So it is like it's a real challenge for folks. And I'll let Jason chime in. I saw his eyebrows a couple times.
I think a lot and I talk a lot about the traditional ecological knowledge of the tribes that have been in this area, not only the Shoshone, but the Arapaho, Lakota, Cheyenne, the Blackfeet. We historically had that ecologically based economy, the buffalo economy, the health and wealth and the biodiversity of the plants and animals. What was brought with settlers and pioneers was a paradigm based in economics, and it was about control. And so domesticating, plowing up, paving over, fencing in, fencing out. That really is what fueled the disconnect of our people from the land base, because also brought was the idea of private land ownership. There was no idea of owning the land. That wasn't a concept for our people, because as part of the system, it didn't make sense to section off some here and some there. But that was a forced paradigm, an imposed system onto the tribes, where they said, you're either going to become farmers and ranchers or we're going to take your land. And they took the land. And so then our people were forced into a sedentary lifestyle, reliant on the federal government for food and rations. And there's this intergenerational trauma that has happened. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, as the land managing agency for the federal government, has continued with that status quo that we have to manage our lands for agriculture and grazing. And that is really not in the best interest of the two tribes, who are historically buffalo people. So despite the land management of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that has prioritized cattle over wildlife, the tribes have been successful in managing and restoring the wildlife species through codes and regulations. Our own game code in 1984 allowed us to reintroduce pronghorn antelope and bighorn sheep, which were extirpated prior to 1984. In the 90s, we passed wolf and grizzly bear management plans where we went to the elders of both tribes for 3 years, gathering information about our traditional perspectives about these species. And the elders told us that wolves and bears, again, are our relatives. They belong. We should protect them. We've learned a lot from how to be good human beings from watching them and observing them. So that was written into the plan. And that's where we have a good example of traditional ecological knowledge mending well with modern wildlife management and conservation, where we look at a holistic land management policy where we can shift from a priority in cattle to that of wildlife habitat or bison restoration in some areas, like the mountains or in riparian areas where there shouldn't be cattle. We have to be reminded that cattle do not replace buffalo on the landscape. Bison, many don't know that there's 4 extinct species of bison, going back to latifrons, which had a 15-foot horn span and was 10 feet at the shoulder. One of our sister tribes over in Idaho recently found a latifron skull on their reservation, 350,000 years old. So latifrons and these other subsequent species that are gone adapted throughout the ice ages. And so, the pronghorn antelope and the bison, really came through that last ice age, and where other species were diminished. The short-faced bear, and the giant sloth, and the woolly mammoth. We've got stories about some of these things. And bison, has 7 times the hair per square inch as a cow. And in the winter grows a winter coat and then sloughs that off in the spring. That hair is very important for many bird species. And so when there were millions of bison, the abundance of birds would have been similar. And we know that certain bird species actually need buffalo hair for their eggs to reach the right incubation temperature. There's examples of butterflies and reptiles and salamanders and other insects that benefit from the presence of bison. They have twice the surface area on their teeth as a cow, allowing them to eat less woodier species and control their metabolism in the winter so that they don't have to eat as much and can rely on snow. So they're very well adapted, and probably one of the most significant behaviors of bison is their wallowing, their dust bathing behavior that creates micro depressions in the landscape. Very important for water accumulation and seed dispersal. Bison primarily eat the graminoids or the grasses and allows the forb species to grow. And actually a lot of our foods and tools and medicines historically used were often associated with bison wallows. And so in the tall grass prairie, we have evidence of places where this has been shown. In my own research through MSU, Montana State University, I looked at cultural plant biodiversity in relic wallows. So even though buffalo hadn't been using these wallows in 130 years, I was able to determine or show statistically that 3 species still in fact serve a purpose or are benefited by these relic wallows. So the physiological and behavioral adaptations of bison in the landscape is what distinguishes them as a keystone species. We restore, if we wanted to talk about climate resiliency or carbon storage, it should be about improving and increasing plant and animal biodiversity. Well, we actually do that by restoring the keystone species. And so what we're doing on some reservations and restoring the keystone species is healing the land and making a place for buffalo that can in turn heal us. Because native people, with the removal of that animal from our diet has resulted in the highest rates of diabetes and heart disease and other health-related issues. We're actually pushing for federal legislation, the Indian Buffalo Management Act, which would approve appropriations to support tribal buffalo programs in a way that it recognizes them as a treaty right, and actually have federal support to help us restore our buffalo to the landscape. Some tribes have more capability than others, but there's also the opportunity to help tribal and other non-tribal cattle producers switch to managing buffalo because of their role on the landscape. So in our reservations, it's not only to get them back on the land, help them to think about keystone species restoration and land use change really is just decolonizing our land use, but also the nutritional and the cultural importance of getting this animal back into our communities. And so the buffalo really runs very deep in our tribal communities and has implications in many, many other areas.
Great. I want to bring in potentially we have some great audience questions here. Thank you both. This is such a great, rich conversation we're having here. But I want to pick up on maybe, Jason, where you were ending it and let Maggie chime in a little bit, because I think in our episode last week, one of our guests, Terry, one of her kind of main takeaways had been that, grazing is this important ecological practice and feature for grasslands, and that it's better to have something out there grazing rather than nothing. And that it helps, of course, provide livelihoods to communities and it helps conserve land. So, Jason, you were talking a lot about bison and their importance, but Maggie, can you elaborate a little bit more on cattle? Because there are absolutely differences between the two.
Thank you, Kristen. There are absolutely differences. Jason may be able to offer a more scientific explanation of the differences. I will share, though it is not the same, and Jason mentioned this, cattle are not a replacement for bison or buffalo in how our grasslands evolved. But I do think there have been some concerted effort in grazing communities to put in place grazing management techniques that in some ways replicate migratory herds of animals, so that you are still providing rest in places. So similar to people of the grasslands, buffalo moved through the grasslands and were responsive to seasons and changes in weather and things like that. And so, for example, Hanna Ranch operates a relatively high intense grazing rotation in which we graze through a number of different paddocks for a certain number of days. And that allows the ranch to have a high grazing pressure, which grasses have responded under grazing pressures, as you noted. And then it leaves rest for the duration of the year so that grass also has the ability to recover. Every animal grazes differently. Jason mentioned the size of teeth. Location of teeth is also an interesting thing. And I don't actually know this about bison. I was just checking to see if there was any indicator on the skull above my head. But horses and cattle, for example, have a different location of their front teeth. So cattle only have front bottom teeth. So when they graze a grass, they are tearing it with their tongue instead of biting it off. A horse has top and bottom front teeth, and so they are actually scissoring off those grass species. So, and we see different grazing habits with all different animals. Hanna Ranch, for a number of years in the mid-90s, made a concerted effort at a multi-species grazing rotation, which included buffalo, cattle, and goats. I will say, I think the pressures on the grazing system had positive impacts. I am not sure our community was ready to receive buffalo, and maybe we could have used some mentorship from communities like Jason's, because we had some issues that were more cultural than they were responses in the land. So I do think there are differences in cattle and bison and buffalo. And I think the other hard part comes back to, at least for the ag community, marketability of product. We have a large buffalo operator in northern New Mexico, And even to get buffalo processed for to distribute to a direct-to-consumer meat protein market, they are sending buffalo from New Mexico to Brush, Colorado to have them processed. So there are challenges in systems that we have put in place in the agricultural community that create pretty dramatic challenges for making a transition in livestock and how we operate in terms of what animals we are grazing and how those animals function in a landscape and in an operation. So I will let Jason add differences between bison and cattle.
That was a pretty good answer there. I don't know how to really really think about that other than in terms of grazing pressure and intensity. And what comes to mind for me is the Yellowstone and really the carrying capacity, because previously the carrying capacity has been somewhat under pressure politically to be a lower number than really it can be. And there's a new environmental impact statement where there's three alternatives, really. One, keeping the bison population as it is, which is actually about 5,000 right now. And second alternative is to increase it to 6,500. And then the third alternative is even up to 8,000. This is because of a study by Chris Jeremiah in the Yellowstone, who has indicated that intense bison grazing is beneficial for the regrowth of plant, as Maggie mentioned. So that intensity is very important. And then a rest is also important. And so bison, if they have a large enough landscape, rotationally graze on their own. And their instinct is to graze and move. And so if you think of the Avery method or some of the modern agricultural approaches to mimic, this, it is actually just mimicking what bison do automatically. One of the things I'm trying to do here at Wind River is to get a large enough land base, because we haven't got them to the status as wildlife yet. But until then, we can continue to piece together as much land as possible. I've got about 2,000 acres right now for 65 animals. But really the goal is to remove the interior fences then. And so, there's several properties that have been pieced together that are contiguous. And as we remove those interior fences, then they can move independently in there. So we're working with a couple programs to look at those ecological changes using remote sensing technology, because we know bison will increase plant and animal biodiversity. Then we should be able to measure that in reflectance, or utilizing our remote sensing technology now to show that. And really one of the goals could be carbon credits, that bison restoration is a form of carbon sequestration, and that can actually assist in helping fund some of our buffalo restoration projects as we start to get to more large scale buffalo changes. And there's 76 tribes that are members of the Intertribal Buffalo Council, and across there is a very varying spectrum of what tribes can do. Some are in it for the economics. Some are in it to feed their school lunch programs. Some manage a commercial herd and a conservation herd. Very few tribes, though, have a large enough land base to manage bison in what we could call a wildlife setting, free roaming on hundreds of thousands of acres. The potential for that exists here if we can think of buffalo as wildlife and make the protections happen as such. And it isn't to market the meat. There's the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative, which is a newly established program to work closely with both tribes. The mission really is to reconnect our youth and community with buffalo. And so when we do a buffalo harvest, we ensure it's a field harvest because that is the most culturally appropriate way to handle that animal, to take it where it is, not to round them up and put them on a truck and ship them to the slaughterhouse. That is, to us as tribal people, somewhat inhumane. And that's why there's a problem with some of the with the USDA, for example. We've been trying to push these mobile processing units that could be available to tribes so that, the 76 tribes of ITB scattered across various regions could utilize these mobile units and harvest in the field enough animals to get back into our people. So, for here at Wind River, we won't sell the meat, but we will facilitate the harvest and the cultural reconnection of how we use that animal from the hoof up, and then ensure that that meat gets out to our elders and disabled folks and community members for free. That this is a way to incentivize getting that back into our diet again. And, with our traditional foods, and that kind of revival of being healthy, living, a balanced lifestyle is about returning and healing ourselves. And, you often hear about what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. And so, if we've taken down fences and we're restoring buffalo and we're restoring the integrity of our rivers and making sure that fish have clean water, that's all going to reflect on us again, because what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. Restoring that buffalo is very important for our cultural reconnection and for our food source.
Thank you. We've got about 8 minutes left here. I'm going to work in this audience comment. I'm going to read it, and then it'll play into both some things you both are talking about, and perhaps you can share and enlighten our audience with a little bit more thought around this. But one of our guests comments that they have 5 acres, noting it's more than most in the Fort Collins area. And it has been like pulling teeth from cats to try to learn how and what to do to rehabilitate and preserve this small space. If it's hard for me, someone looking for it, it must be very hard for an urban dweller or someone else to recognize and feel the need to act. It kind of reflects some other comments that we've been seeing here in the chat, and both of what you all are talking about of potentially some policies and some positive directions of things that are moving, and how do we incentivize some of this need to both think about conserving and rehabilitating lands. Could you share some of that stuff that you see as moving in the right direction in this regard? And what is allowing us to move into this hopefully a better direction? Maggie, you want to start, or Jason, please go ahead. I see Jason. Why don't you start, and Maggie, please chime on. Yeah.
I was just going to say that we have unique circumstances and challenges in a rural environment versus an urban one. And, I work for the National Wildlife Federation, and we have a backyards wildlife habitat program. Perhaps that's an avenue to look into assistance in, preserving some of the natural setting of that 5 acres. And so that would be an avenue for a smaller land base like 5 acres. But in terms of larger landscape, land use change, we have to think again about shifting from an economic priority, whether that's oil and gas and development or grazing, and really that really doesn't even fit. But if we thought about it in terms of the ecological integrity, if we valued that more than what the dollar brings in, and then I think that it becomes more of an obligation rather than a right. We're often taught to think about our rights as human beings, but we as human beings actually have obligations, and that is to be stewards and caretakers. That is more evident in our tribal communities, and that's due to the connection. You see it across Indigenous communities across the planet, about the importance of food, taking care of our food, taking care of our water, and those being priority over the bottom line.
I am going to respond to this question wearing my CCALT hat. So private lands conservation is certainly an option. I think as you look at restoration, I think one of the challenges with the term conservation is that it's really big and it means something different if you're talking about conserving a conservation bison herd or a conservation easement or river conservation. I would note in my personal life, I sit on the conservation district board in my local community. I would encourage folks to reach out to local resources like soil conservation districts. I know that there are a number up in Larimer and Weld County. Fort Collins is cool because you have CSU in your backyard. And Colorado State University Extension has a lot of really impressive resources for landowners who are working on doing some private conservation in their own space and time. And I think the other piece, the piece that is challenging for cattlemen's, we do large landscape conservation. So to date, in the last 27 years, Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust has conserved 705,000 acres of working lands around the state of Colorado. Those lands are still owned and operated by private operators. They are components and or the entirety of agricultural operations. We do not, we are looking at conserving functional working lands. And so urban acreage is sort of out of our wheelhouse, although there are a number of land trusts and conservation organizations working in that space that could be resources. So I'm happy to provide additional resources, but how do we create engagement and what is the future of these conversations? I think one of the really hard parts about the fact that we have commoditized our relationship to land is that we now, it's hard to extract from that relationship. And I think if you have a vested interest in knowing that your children and grandchildren could see bison or could see cattle and could drive for 2 hours and not see any other structure, if that is a future that you have in your mind for your next generations, conservation at some level is an important conversation to be having, whether it is on an urban 5-acre parcel or a 27,000 acre carbon sequestration project in Southeast Colorado. This is about all of us together. And if we don't protect the land, there are limited opportunities for us in the future. You know, without the land, we can't bring bison back. Without the land, we can't produce food. Without the land, we don't have advanced civil society. If we can't feed ourselves, how do we have these broader conversations about civil society and our human engagements? So 5 acres, yay.
I am enthralled. You all have been excellent guests, and it was quite fascinating for our audience who don't know. Right before we started, Maggie and Jason and I were talking, and you know, there's so much inherent tension and conflict, and you saw those ideas in essence surfacing in both of the remarks throughout today. And we were going to talk about overcoming conflict, but you know, you all have been providing such, I think, fascinating, positive, hopeful ideas and pathways forward. It's so refreshing. So thank you both. I want to leave you and our audience having one final thought, if that's okay. Maybe take, you know, 30 seconds to a minute each and just share one thought. What's something that you absolutely love or are most hopeful about for the places and the animals that you currently steward?
Maggie.
Jason, you were already unmuted. I will say just my personal connection to grasslands is this power of place. I think people who for generations have carved out a life in a really tough environment, there is something special about who they are as people. And I think the grit that comes from choosing a life in a hard environment is one of the really special pieces. I always love the subtlety of prairies and grasslands. So I would charge everyone with remembering that as you drive east on I-70 or I-80, and you think, gosh, there's nothing out here. I cannot wait till I get to a gas station, to think that like someone really cares about that place and someone worked really hard to make sure that it still existed. So thanks for being part of this.
Yeah, I think grasslands are our most threatened ecosystem, and we often don't think of it as something that needs to be protected because it's like a vast sea, a vast ocean out there. And being by the mountains here, I really appreciate being able to get out into the grasslands and how small you feel. That's a really humbling experience, and what human beings should feel when we go to those places. And I think often of the paupers who had this idea in the 80s because they recognized that people were moving out of the rural communities and moving into the cities, that there were these ranches and places that where the fencing was no longer needed. And so they proposed the Buffalo Commons. And it was just an idea to, there's nobody living there anyway. Let's take these fences down and restore the keystone species. And so as we're successful or moving the paradigm on some of our tribal projects to restore buffalo as wildlife, I think that the conversation is going to morph into really what keystone species looks like on public lands. And public lands belong to all of you, all of us. And how they are managed and prioritized should be shifted also to make sure that we're always thinking about the ecological integrity of many of these important places, that some of which are not plowed up, paved over, fenced in or fenced out or domesticated, that we have some larger landscapes that we can ensure are protected for future generations, that there will be species conservation and biodiversity that exists better than what it does today. And so we as Americans, we can make that happen. And so having this conversation today is very, very helpful and informative. And I want to thank Maggie and Kristen and everyone for the opportunity to sit and visit with you today. So thank you.
Thank you both. I feel absolutely humbled and grateful to have spent the past hour with both of you. I learned a ton myself. Our audience is extremely grateful. A huge thank you to both of you for joining us today. A huge thank you to our audience for tuning in and listening and taking away hopefully some really insightful ways of thinking about the grasslands. A huge thank you to all of our partners involved. And just as a reminder, this is episode 2 in a 4-part series. Next week, same time, same place. We'll be joining with a couple more guests to be talking about restoring wildlife to Larimer County grassland ecosystems, kind of bringing it all down to a very localized example. In essence, we're calling it Back from the Brink, and some of the success that's been happening out there outside of Larimer in Larimer County. Thank you all very well. Take care of yourselves. It was great seeing you here and joining us today. We hope to see you back here next week. Thank you.